The question is around my impressions of what's happened here in Belfast. I think the first thing to say is that I have only been here 2 days, so I would not be foolish enough to try and make any kind of judgment. But what's really interesting to me, and this relates to what I've seen in other countries throughout the world, is what a long process it is to get from an initial political agreement to something that really sticks at the social level. I think a lot of politicians don't understand that what they do, although it's essential, is not enough on its own. You have to have a really strong community base for real reconciliation. And what I'm sure that you've learned here, and is something that is really valuable for other societies, is just how difficult that is. The whole economic dimension is both really important and really tough. If you look at most societies that have been through generations of violence and trauma, first of all, the economic situation is lousy. So you have groups that are impoverished, particularly you have young people who have very few economic opportunities. That makes them much more open to being recruited in different ways, be it for political violence or criminal violence or some mishmash of both kinds of violence. But it's really tough to regenerate the kind of economic dynamism that can help lift people out of that. One figure that we have is for, in the aftermath of civil wars, it takes on average around 20 years for your generic country to recover to the trade levels that it had prior to the conflict. That's the longest lag you see in most of these recovery indicators, and precisely because investors come back last of all. So if the physical landscape is still confrontational, if there are long-term process of working these things out between communities, it's really hard to get investors to say, okay, well actually I want to go and put my factory or my program in that area. To expect it to happen on its own is very simplistic. And usually where there is some investor uptake, it takes a tremendous amount of public sector support. So, in my view, I don't think we should talk at all about fragile states and non-fragile states for two reasons. First of all, it's a stigma. So nobody likes to be called a fragile state. Second, it means that countries that, at least in the World Bank's definition, are not fragile, may think that they don't share some of the experiences of these poorest traumatized societies. Whereas in fact, the experience of violence and how to deal with it has tremendous common points across rich, middle income and poor countries. Now, I think what's more useful is to talk about the fragility of the institutions or the fragility of the process. That's, I think, something we can all understand and it's not stigmatic in the same way. So one thing that we do see is that a certain solidity in terms of recovery of trust and confidence, but then critically in building these legitimate institutions in policing, in approaches to economic development, and above all in having systems that can address profoundly felt injustice, whatever that is in a particular situation. It's that sort of fragility and how you deal with it that's more important than labeling a state as being fragile or not. To understand the stress factors that provoke violence in the first place. Now they're going to be very different according to the history, the dynamics, the particular conflict that's going on. Having said that, they tend to cluster in three areas, and what works best in the transitional process that we've studied is where societies and their governments address all three of these together. And these are essentially security-related stress factors that often has a lot to do with the behavior and the perceptions of the security forces. Second, this whole area of injustice. What is it that aggrieves people? What is it? In what areas of their life experience do they feel left out, insulted, abused, to an extreme extent? And the third area is a simpler one, which is economic opportunity, and the ability to earn a livelihood for yourself and your family, and to have that kind of dignity. Those three sort of very broad areas have tended to be dealt with and addressed by those societies that have had the most success in working their way out of violence in the last 2 generations. And here I'm talking about countries like Indonesia, South Africa, Argentina, Liberia, Timor-Leste, a variety of countries, different situations, different parts of the world. And in all cases, this is a very extended, imperfect, messy, contentious process. And it's really important that politicians and analysts, folks like myself, come to understand what an extended process it is and how it really never ends.